This is Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur with your host, Lynn Freest. Lynn will share ideas and expert advice from people that are walking in your shoes and living their encore careers, where they want and at the pace they want. You'll start a company of one with confidence and knowledge to live a fulfilled life of freedom and ease. Lynn is a coach and leadership consultant whose mission is to show senior leaders and experts how to start something refreshing and new after a full career in the corporate environment.
Welcome to this episode of the podcast, Creating Your Encore Career and Becoming a Silver Entrepreneur. This is episode 118. It's titled Getting to Know Yourself and Stop Getting in Your Own Way. Conversation with Michele Nevarez. So making the leap from being a corporate leader and expert into becoming a solo entrepreneur can be daunting, but the rewards are great. You can work when you want, where you want, and do the work you love. I can be that guide and thinking partner for you. As your coach, I will help you go farther and faster based on what I've learned from being on this journey for several years. If you have thoughts about starting an encore career, please contact me and take the self-assessment quiz. The quiz will help you get some quick clarity around what's possible for you in the future. After you listen to the podcast, I encourage you to visit my website at lynnfreest.com and download the PDF as a guide to help you take your next steps in pursuit of your encore career. Well, today we're going to be talking with a good friend, Michele Nevarez, about the book she has just published. It's titled Beyond Emotional Intelligence, A Guide to Accessing Your Full Potential. Now, I've worked with Michele for several years, and I became a certified meta-coach in emotional intelligence while working with her group. It's been both an honor and a privilege to learn and work with her and her new Beyond EI team. Michele and the Beyond EI group are committed to bringing emotional intelligence to life by transforming theory into meaningful action. And just a note from the book's introduction, discover the inner workings of your mind so you can break unhelpful habits and you can set yourself on the path to achieving your full potential. So some of the questions we're going to talk about with Michele today are this audience, how are they making the transition from corporate leader and expert to consultant and entrepreneur? And how does working with this book and the 12 self-discoveries help them do that? And then because there are 12 self-discoveries, we'll talk about where are the first couple that might be most useful to start with. Also, we'll spend a few minutes thinking about new habits of action as well as new habits of thinking that this book could help you develop. And finally, in talking with Michele about her own journey, she's learned to talk about a complex value statement to a potential audience, such as emotional intelligence. And again, from her insights on that, it would help you as a leader expert learn how to talk about your value proposition to your potential clients. Welcome, Michele. It's great to have you with us. And I'd really like you to just start off by sharing a little bit about yourself, your journey, and of course, your new book.
Thank you, Lynn, for having me today. That's really kind. It's felt like a bit of a circuitous journey, but it's pretty exciting. The book I just wrote, Beyond Emotional Intelligence, A Guide to Accessing Your Full Potential, will be released in a few short weeks on November 17th. And so that in itself felt like at least a few lifetimes. When you write a book in 6 months, it turns out that's not an easy thing to do, and to live a life and run a company and have kids and all of this kind of thing. But it was a great honor to be able to do this. I always thought that I would hopefully write a book one day. I just really didn't know what it would be about and when that would happen. And I'm blessed because Wiley Publishing reached out to me during the pandemic and invited me to write about the 12 self-discoveries. And as you know, Lynn, from having been through the Emotional Intelligence Coaching Certification Program, the 12 self-discoveries are basically the kind of heart of our coaching approach and derive from insights from coaching executives and leaders over the last 20, 25 years. So I just started to notice some patterns of where people typically get stuck. What I noticed is that there are these kind of areas that kept coming up again and again. And I ended up noticing and naming those patterns according to the 12 self-discoveries. And that's essentially what the book is about. Takes quite a deep dive into the neuroscience behind the 12 self-discoveries because I didn't know what they were. But in a nutshell, that's a little bit about the book anyway.
Yeah. it was interesting as we got involved in the coaching certification program, and I'm sure others had the same experience I did that, okay, did Michele just find all those roadblocks that I've been personally experiencing? Because I've clearly found that many of the things in my way were in the area between my ears.
It's so often the case. None of us really means to get in our own way, but that's precisely what happens. Things are sometimes too close and we can't see what we can't see. And then when it's presented to us, like you said, it's obvious, like, why didn't I see this? But that's really the phase at which somebody can do something about it, right? And I know, Lynn, your audience are people who are shifting at some point in their lives, careers, usually people who have maybe spent a better part of a lifetime being an expert at something within corporate or an entrepreneur. And so I think the 12 self-discoveries lend themselves well in a way towards that journey of rediscovering who you are and what motivates and drives you and really what's important and what does it mean to be in alignment ultimately with how you want to live your life and how you want to help and how you want to use your gifts and talents in this life.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And again, it's one of those things I know I encourage my audience because they have to have two mindsets they now hold. One is that of an expert. They need to honor the expertise that they have because sometimes they discount that even. But then on the second side, they have to have the mindset of a beginner because there are new skills they never had to use in corporate America, like marketing or whatever it may be. And so it's that whole idea of, okay, honor my expertise, but also understand that I'm a beginner over here.
It's so true. And I often find that it's that beginner's mind or approaching something we either don't know how to do or haven't done for a really long time that almost puts us in that place of innocence and curiosity and openness to learn something new from a different perspective. And I think you're absolutely right. And it's funny because as we get older, at least I can speak for myself, there are areas where we've dedicated our entire career or lives to studying and learning well. But I'm really amazed, at least in my own journey of not only writing this book, but just my life's journey. I often find myself in this funny place of feeling like maybe I don't know much. Maybe all these things I thought I knew are showing up in different ways in my life where I still have so very much to learn. And I think it's that mindset, of wanting to be open and know that learning process is never done that has a lot of beauty to it anyway.
Oh, I agree. And I know one of the things that people have challenged me on is saying, okay, Lynn, there are things in your life that you think are easy. Other people will actually think they're magic, but you have to, be willing to share that and see what people say, because it's, again, that you do have that expertise, but often you'll say, I don't know if anybody cares about, or recognizing as we try to strive towards mastery of something that it's an unending journey. And so we never arrive.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. I think that's a healthy way to live, though, because life unfolds moment by moment. And often we have this idea, sometimes false, even really notion or expectation that we're going to learn something once and for all. But life is really quite dynamic and requires more of us in each moment that we actually can't anticipate exactly. And often it's the case the rug is pulled out. And so that's why I know I don't have to tell you because you are an EI coach, but that's, I think, the value of learning these skills and techniques and practices to be more emotionally intelligent that allows us to hopefully be that much more skillful and wise in the moment, no matter what comes up. So we can react with poise and skill and grace and elegance in moments that are sometimes really difficult to do that. And so the good news is that we can inch the needle, we can move the needle on our own capacity to deal with life itself and the things that come up.
Sure. Building on that, while you give a real rich description of what it is, I think you and your organization also focus in, okay, how do we really, as you say, embody it? Not how just know about it, but how do we
Yes.
actually get going on it?
Yes, absolutely. Lynn, that's so true. When I started this venture, and I'll mention this because it is very much tied to what I write about in the book and the bigger question you asked me at the beginning of our conversation about my journey in general. When we started 5-6 years ago, it's going on 6 now, to create these suite of offerings that we now offer globally to individuals and businesses that focus on taking the theory of emotional intelligence into applied practice, as you say. One of the things that I asked myself at that point was, here I am looking at the 4 domains and 12 competencies, which is from the most popular model of EI, the Goleman-Boyatzis model. And I was asking myself, wow, that's a lot of stuff that a person has to know how to do well. Where do you start? And so just by asking that question of where does a person start? And if I'm feeling overwhelmed as the person who's supposed to put this experience together, how are the people going to feel who are going to go through it? And really, like you say, try to apply and develop these skills such that they can embody them and not just talk about them or write about them or know about them, what we say in a declarative sort of way. And so when I asked that question of where does a person start, what I did is I looked for the common denominators. What are the smallest common denominators within that model? Because that's the model we were working with at the time, that allow us to perform any one or more of these 4 domains and 12 competencies. And what we came up with at the time really were the foundational skills of EI. That, as you know, became the model for how we then coach our clients and teach these topics in an online setting in an applied way. And I think it's that narrowing down to what are the prerequisites? What are those things that allow us to do anything well whatsoever? And so in the book, I explained that question asking process ultimately led me to the work I'm doing now, which was to ask a bigger question. How do we deal skillfully with all of our perceptions, not just our emotions, although emotions are a hugely important component of that, as we all know and experience every moment we're alive. And so that's really the essence of what I've tried to boil this work down to is, what do we have influence over?
Yeah. And another thing I really enjoyed is as you talk about this 12 self-discoveries, you came across in there with language that I could really understand and relate to, even if I wasn't as familiar with maybe some of the neuroscience. And maybe you could list just a couple of the 12 discoveries to help describe that for us.
Absolutely. So I named a number of them whimsically, but the first one that kind of underlies the entire approach is ignite your inner coach. And when we had started the training, when you were doing the certification, I guess it was in 2018, we used to call that one unpack your parachute. But ultimately, what we evolved to is calling it ignite your inner coach, because it's this idea that we each have within us inherently the wisdom and the wherewithal to bring about any change in our lives that we focus on and that we deem important and important enough to practice again and again and apply again and again. And so within this 12 self-discovery, as well as the coaching model, it's this idea that we build a core trust and capacity to tap into that sort of inner wisdom that we each possess. And in order to do that, often we need to quiet the mind. We need to center. We need to be able to let go of the things that may be clouding our vision or getting in the way of how we think about ourselves or our lives in a way that maybe isn't helpful, right? And then cultivate the opposite. Build evidence in the direction of what we want to believe about ourselves, what's helpful to believe about ourselves. So that's one. Another one, they're all interrelated too, I must say. One feeds into the next, and they're all kind of woven together. And that's not really an accident, because often you can't really separate these things discreetly within the human brain or even within the process of perception itself. Related to that is another 12 self-discovery. You are the common denominator. And it's this idea that ultimately we are the source of our own perceptions And we're the source of our own emotions, and we're the source of our own responses and outcomes related to that value chain of how perception itself functions. And so often, though, the way we mistakenly, myself included, experience reality is it's somewhere outside of us. All of these things are taking place outside of us. And therefore, it's really easy to fall into the trap of believing, oh, the problem's out there, or the enemy is out there. The obstacle is external to myself. When in reality, so much of how we make sense of the world and what happens and our perceptions, right? It all happens within our own brain. And we're the ones making sense of these perceptions. And so as much as our finger might be pointed outwards in a sort of blaming sort of fashion, ultimately that finger is more like a boomerang. It always, points true north right back at oneself. When people realize that, I've coached many people who maybe had the mindset that it's always somebody else's fault, or poor me, or we can all fall into that kind of poor me syndrome a bit, but it's not helpful because we give away our agency when we do that. But when we can take personal accountability and responsibility for our outcomes and our perceptions that lead to those outcomes, that's very empowering, it turns out. Those are two among many, and I'm happy to continue. I just want to make sure you have a chance to ask me questions or weigh in, because you're experienced with these too.
And the other thing, when you mention outcomes, you make a clear distinction that the world is creating outcomes all the time, some of which we can influence, some of which we can't. We do have to remember that there are things we can influence: our attitude, our response, but that doesn't mean because we go through these, we're going to influence the world necessarily the way we want it.
So true. And it's very timely, because that's the third self-discovery is, what do you have influence over? And isn't it true? I'm sure you've seen this in coaching clients over the years, Lynn, or even with your own life. Often we perseverate or get stuck and cling to the things we have absolutely no control over, in lieu of the things, like you just said, that we can take action on. And so much of this book that I've written is basically taking the building blocks from a neuroscience standpoint of what we do have influence over. And it turns out that we have influence over quite a lot. While a lot of perception and emotion occur on what we call a pre-conscious basis, meaning we don't consciously formulate these things because the brain is predictive by nature. It has to take its best guess well in advance to be able to determine how it's going to react and respond and have all the things function, both psychologically and physiologically. But within that soup, so to say, it turns out at a fundamental level, our own awareness and capacity to maneuver our own awareness, to take on different perspectives. Like sometimes we can take a big picture. Sometimes we can narrow in or focus when we need to be detail oriented. Sometimes it's just a matter of noticing, wow, I've become really too focused here, or too focused on what isn't working, or you name it. Our awareness has the capacity to narrow or widen or broaden or see big picture, little picture, etc. And so when we gain some familiarity with our own awareness through certain micro techniques, we can learn to take on a perspective that is more helpful for the situation. And similarly, we can learn to be conscious sense makers. And what that means is that while our brain may deliver its own curation or rendering of our perception and emotions, like a meaning, basically, we can, in the moment, remind ourselves, using one of the 12 self-discoveries, to cue up a new behavior sequence. We're basically reframing our understanding of what's just happened in our perceptions, and instead shifting it to an understanding that's going to be more helpful to the relationship and to the situation.
Yeah, when you've talked about that in the past, it always brings up, again, a teaching somebody gave me years ago was saying, okay, how do I react differently when my child spills milk at the table versus when a guest spills milk at the table? Same thing happened, but if I can consciously have that in the back of my mind, okay, I have a choice for a little different response maybe that I may have.
It's so true, Lynn. And that's such a good example of how in the moment we can get really carried away with our initial, even just habitual tendencies in reaction to it, like an everyday situation, right? Like, for example, to your point, we could find that we're in traffic and behind a slow car, or find that we're getting impatient and then we're about ready to honk, or we may be riding their tail a little closer than we should. And then we look up and notice, oh gosh, that's my boss, or that's my neighbor, or it jolts us into, how should I be acting? How should I be treating this other person in this situation? And so that's exactly what I mean by saying that we can work with our original kind of the perceptions that our brain delivers up for us. We can push back on them, it turns out, and we can say, okay, that's one interpretation. Where is the benefit of the doubt in any given situation? And think how often, if we had given the benefit of the doubt, how differently things would have gone versus jumping to this or that conclusion.
Yeah. And I think, again, with the stuff you've described, it also gives us a little grace, because I've often had people say, I just should never think that or react that way. This just gives you a chance to do it differently. It's not to say your brain's been working on these things for a long time, so they don't just disappear because you've had a new awareness.
Oh, so true. That's so true. It's kind of exhilarating because each new moment, we have a new moment to try. It's a lot of moments to practice, actually. And so I think adopting that, exactly that frame of mind, Lynn, of this is ongoing moment to moment work we're talking about. And really, when we train in these practices and becoming more emotionally intelligent, ultimately, it allows us to be more nimble, irrespective of the circumstances or the context, right? We have that much more chance that we are going to show up in a way that reflects who we are and who we want to be and how we want to be perceived.
Yeah. And in terms of building those new, lack of a better word, muscles in our perception and stuff, I've always appreciated with your work is that two aspects. One is the journaling and two is the micro techniques. And in both of those, often as I've worked with senior executives or anybody, they just have this sense of no time kind of a thing. And yet it doesn't mean to work on these, you don't have to go off to the mountains, although people do that. That's wonderful. Some of the micro techniques or the journaling, that can be done with just a few minutes. And maybe you could describe how some of that you came around with those ideas.
Absolutely, Lynn. Great question. In one of our earliest formulations, like I mentioned, of the 4 domains of emotional intelligence, and for the listeners who may not know those off the top of their head, which I certainly wouldn't be surprised if they didn't, self-awareness and self-management and social awareness, and then relationship management. Those are the 4 domains. And then within those, you have the 12 competencies. And I won't name them all because people wouldn't remember anyway. But when we formulated what we term the foundational skills, which are those things we could think about as prerequisites, right? By doing these 6 things well and learning to be proficient, at least more than when we started our endeavor, allows a person to create the conditions to be good at the more complex competencies that require not just emotional intelligence, but actually maybe some technical training, and not only technical training, but applying all of those things in different settings. So it takes real sort of what we call procedural knowledge of application. And so part of the reason we formulated the 6 foundational skills the way we did is because they represented a direct crosswalk with the best of what we understood at the time about the neuroscience really of emotion itself. And so based on Dr. Richard Davidson's work, who I had the pleasure of working with, he and his team as an adjunct faculty member at University of Wisconsin School of Business, and then Center for Healthy Minds, which is the nonprofit that he started and runs today. We took the insights of 30 years of his research as a neuroscientist, and he had written a book with Sharon Begley at the time in 2012 called The Emotional Life of Your Brain. We took those insights and formulated them into a program, not dissimilar in many ways, audience-wise, to a lot of the companies that Beyond EI works with today. But what I noticed when I started working with Daniel Goleman's model and Dr. Richard Boyatzis' model of EI is there was a direct overlap. And even though Richie didn't do his work in service of EI, he did his work in service of the question of why do some people recover more easily, more nimbly from setbacks than others? And that was for a question he was trying to answer in his work. And what he discovered is that these micro techniques, which he calls them also contemplative practices, you could call them mindfulness practice, meditation even, that with the practice of these certain, micro techniques to train the brain, you can actually literally using the neuroplasticity feature of our brain, start to shape and change tendencies in meaningful ways. And so, for example, there was a study, one of many that he did over the years, where they took a group of people and they, of course, had a, group that it was randomly selected and people who'd never meditated. And they basically had them do a compassion practice for 20 minutes every day for 2 weeks. And they had taken fMRI measurements and various studies of their brain prior to this experiment and after. And what they showed is even just in that 2-week period of, I believe it's 20 minutes, could be 30 minutes a day, which isn't much when you think of a full day, their brain did show signs of changing. And not only that, when they then gave these people an opportunity to spend $100, I believe it was, any way they wished, they spent it in pro-social ways, meaning they purchased things for other people, not themselves. And so it bore out in reality and not just in their brains. Really, the upshot of what I'm telling you is that we now know that certain practices whereby we increase our attention or our awareness, our compassion, our empathy, they actually make a difference in our ability to show up as more emotionally intelligent people in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think in addition to that, the journaling for me has always been interesting because just putting something on a piece of paper, somehow getting it out of my head and onto a piece of paper makes a difference. And then it's the repetitive. So even if I'm journaling a paragraph a day, a few sentences a day, all of a sudden I can start, my noticing changes. I know that.
I love it.
What was your experience as far as having people journal and doing this work?
Yeah, so I think journaling serves quite a number of purposes. One, it's shown to have positive impact overall on somebody's ability to develop introspection and self-awareness, because like you say, you're bringing attention again and again just through the act of spending even just 5 minutes journaling. It's not like somebody has to write a book. I guess in this case, I did. I'm playing a little anyway. But so the 12 self-discoveries in particular lend themselves really well to journal prompts. And so as you know, in our program, they form the basis of journaling and prompts that people can start to pay attention to things they would normally miss, things that they would just habitually do without giving it much thought. And like you say, journaling itself is an attentional training activity of I'm going to pay attention to whatever's on my mind and I'm just going to write it. And then the other really powerful thing about journaling, apart from what you yourself mentioned, is that particularly whether you're working with a coach or not, but especially in the beginning when it's harder to see these things oneself, the coach can start to pick up on and help the client spot areas where they're getting stuck again and again, or even where they're using certain language that thematically points to a particular hang up they're having. I'll give you an example. So one of the other 12 self-discoveries is emptying your head trash. And closely related to that would be seeing the best in self and others, the flip side of the same coin. And in journaling, if, for example, you find that you have repetitive self-deprecation or thoughts, things about whether it's, we hear a lot about imposter syndrome or I'm not lovable, or you could pretty much fill in the blank as a human being for all the different ways we feel at different times. But if you start to see a pattern, then you say, okay, maybe I should do something about that. Maybe I need to build evidence in a direction that's actually helpful, where I start to spot and see the best in myself and even other people, because we don't just do this to ourselves. We do this to others unknowingly as well.
Yeah, I know in certainly my work with people, sometimes simply the words I see repeated, especially if they're, I'll say, knocking yourself down kind of words.
Yes.
I'll point out and say, have you got a definition around that word or something like that? And, oh, they said, didn't know I'd use that word so often.
Yes. Yes. And we find also that the journals, the same kind of language people use in their journals, they tend to use verbally also, and or self-talk, the things we say to ourselves. And so I think that ties nicely to another of the 12 self-discoveries, which is you don't have to believe everything you think. And this idea that we often take at face value what we think about ourselves, about other people, about situations we find ourselves in. We take it pretty seriously. And it can be a gift to give oneself and others to realize those thoughts are actually impermanent. They are temporary. They go away. They're not real in any, sort of objective sort of way. We experience our thoughts and feelings, but they are temporary. Now, they may be pervasive, meaning they come back again and again, but then we also need, in that case, methods to deal with them again and again. So a lot of this work ends up being, and as you say, the journals, a really great mechanism and mirror for the client to do that, because they get to see themselves from a different perspective and hopefully develop strategies to intervene on their own behalf before they get to that really bad place of self-deprecation or perseverating on things that are paralyzing or not helpful.
Again, for me, what provided the opportunity was, okay, this happens and I have that feeling or have that perception of it. But now with journaling, I can sit there and think about, okay, how could I try to do this differently next time around? And it may not succeed next time. That continual keep thinking about, I could do something else the next time this happens, the thing seems to help me anyway.
That's right. I think so. I found it really helpful too. And it's often, like you say, Lynn, when you get to that point of realizing you keep beating your head up against the same wall, and when you can look more objectively back at even a few journal entries from a different perspective of, let's say, you can even look at your own journal entries from the standpoint of, now, if I were a coach and I were coaching myself or a friend or an advocate or just somebody who liked me, wanted the best for me, what would I see? And it's in that kind of place of possibility about what else might be possible if I weren't stuck in these different habitual mental patterns. What else might be possible? And one of the other 12 self-discoveries is titled funny, but it's got a great meaning bundled into it. It's mantras, metaphors, and maps. And often when we work with our clients, we end up getting them to generate their own saying. A mantra is really it has a religious connotation in some settings, but here in this setting, it's just meant to be a cue, a reminder when our awareness kind of falls beneath the surface of what we're consciously aware of. Sometimes a quick phrase or an image or a metaphor can be enough to remind us. So, for example, if I have a habit of getting tense in certain situations or uptight, either because, let's say, there's a lot of change happening, there's uncertainty, there's ambiguity, any number of the things that we deal with day in and day out, every moment of our lives, I could, for example, say to myself, stay open, stay curious. I could generate some visual reminder or a metaphor of let it be smooth and easy, or whatever it is. It's got to be meaningful to you. But we often see these emerge from journaling itself and seeing where are the hot spots, so to say, that we tend to get stuck again and again.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Recently, just the last week or so, I got hooked on a phrase from a advertising campaign for JCPenney. And their phrase for this season is joy, comfort, and peace.
Oh, nice.
And I don't know what it was, but that just really rang with me. And I thought, okay, we're going to keep focusing on that phrase for a while. So,
I love it. I love it. It's so good. I'm sure you've had a lot of clients who've come up with all kinds of things. like this too shall pass, or it's temporary, it's fleeting, things are not always going to be like this, or whatever it is. I think probably people understand.
And in the case of entrepreneurs, I often encourage them to say, I haven't learned how to do this yet. Not I can't learn this, especially for people my age and stuff. Sometimes we think we can't learn something. No, we haven't learned it yet. We can learn a lot. So
I love it. That's very encouraging. And it actually reminds me, Lynn, of a micro technique, as it were, of how to deal with difficult emotions in the moment. Often, I don't know, probably most humans are struck with some kind of negative or disturbing emotion multiple times throughout the day, and to varying degrees depending on what happened. But when we find ourselves in that kind of thick of feeling whatever we're feeling, and our ability to, what we say within kind of the world of neuroscience as interoception, which is just a fancy word for how our emotions manifest on a bodily level by way of sensations and bodily signals. And when we can really key into that and notice and become curious and connect with how we're actually feeling, letting it move through us in its own pacing, in that moment, our own awareness has the capacity to step back from that immediate experience and be a soothing ally, to say, wow, part of me is feeling this way, whatever it is. I'm sad. Maybe I'm feeling a little glum. Maybe I'm feeling a little discouraged, feeling like the world isn't quite as bright today as it was yesterday, whatever is coming up in the moment. And we can experience that. And at the same time, we can say, that's not all of me. That's just a part of me. I don't have to fully identify with absolutely everything. I can feel it. I'm not necessarily pushing it away, but that's not the sum total of who I am. I'm comprised of a lot of things, a lot of qualities, a lot of strengths, etc.
this has been wonderful, Michele. And I'd say, obviously, you have, and your organization has wonderful training that I've participated in and enjoyed and been found very useful. But for the people who are just going to buy the book, how would you suggest that when they buy the book, what might be useful as they start a personal journey through that?
Love it. I hope they do buy the book. Yeah, it was certainly a labor of love, and it was a real honor to write the book. And it's always a little tense to put yourself out there. And I was like, oh my gosh, people are going to read it. What will they think? But one of the things that I'm going to do in the new year, Lynn, is I'm going to start a group of people who want to go through the book with me as the author, who want to, in a kind of not a fast paced way, but just an easy pace. What was it? Joy, comfort, and peace. Maybe I got the words mixed up, but go through in a way that we can just take bites of it and chunks of it and really talk about, what does this mean? And how might we think about this in our day-to-day lives, irrespective of context? And there are places in the book that are more neuroscience heavy, but even so, I've really tried to distill it and make it quite applicable and approachable so that we can apply these things. So anyway, come the new year, I'm going to do that. And it would be fun if people who want to joined in with that. And we'll also have soon a whole new set of courses that are geared around the book and based on at least the best of our understanding these days about how perception and emotion work.
And certainly we'll provide links to both Beyondei, your organization, as well as to the book in our show notes. So we'll look forward to offering that to people.
Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome. Anything else you'd like to share? Just final thoughts for us.
I think ultimately we each in our own lives both have the privilege and responsibility to decide how we're going to move through our lives and show up on this planet with loved ones, with ourselves. And I think when we take the perspective that life is quite short, even though we may lead long, healthy lives, but not knowing how impermanent things are or situations we find ourselves in that we either enjoy or dislike, and knowing they'll go away someday, it makes the importance of doing this work to be able to enact agency in your own life over the things you have the ability to influence ever more important.
Absolutely. Again, thank you, Michele. I really appreciated the conversation, and we'll be looking forward to the book that'll come out about the time this episode is published.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynn, for having me.
Again, many thanks to Michele for sharing her insights on accessing your full potential. Just a quick review. Some of the questions we covered included: how does our audience here, the leader and expert, make that transition to consultant entrepreneur using the 12 discoveries to help us develop new mindsets? What might be the first couple of self-discoveries you might want to look on? We also need to develop new habits of action as well as new habits of thinking. And finally, we had Michele describe from her journey and explaining a fairly complex subject such as EI to a potential client, how you could, again, from your position as an expert or a leader, explain your value proposition to a potential client. Now, in the show notes, we're going to have links to both the Beyondei website and to the book website. And finally, remember, with an Encore career, the rewards are great. You can work when you want, where you want, and do the work you love. As your coach, I will help you go farther and faster based on what I've learned from being on this journey for several years. You have the time, attention, and money to make this leap. So let me help you. If you have thoughts about starting an Encore career, please contact me and take the self-assessment quiz. The quiz will help you get some quick clarity around what's possible for you in the future. And after you listen to the podcast, I encourage you to visit my website at linfrias.com and download the PDF as a guide to help you take the next steps on your pursuit of starting an Encore career. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.